Well, MMA fans have been patiently waiting for a big card in 2017. They're finally getting one on Saturday night. It's UFC 211. It's taking place right here in Dallas, Texas, and it is without a doubt the most stacked card of the year. We'll be talking about it, of course, right here on the MMAfighting.com preview show. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani, standing outside the American Airlines Center here in the Big D. That is the one and only Shaun Al-Shatti. And Shaun, there's no question about it. It's the best card of the year. But here's the big question, in my opinion, for you, right off the top. What's the most interesting fight on this card? Because I don't think that's a layup question.
That is not a layup question. You're hitting me with the hard ones early. I'm going to split the fence on this. I'm going two ways. I'm going Demian Maia versus Jorge Masvidal. There's so much on the line in that fight. That is a fascinating fight to me. And then Frankie Edgar versus Yair Rodriguez. That is a barn burner, and there's so much that could change up the division so much.
So I agree with both those choices. Kind of interesting that there are two title fights on the card, and you didn't pick either one.
Yes.
What does that say about the title fights?
I don't think it says anything.
Okay.
I think it says more about the depth of the card, because both those fights are also fantastic. I mean, the main event obviously is a rematch of a fantastic fight that you and I were at, and that was probably one of the best 5-round fights in the UFC heavyweight history. And then you look at the dynamic between Joanna Jędrzejczyk and Jessica Andrade. That also looks to be a fantastic fight.
So as you just mentioned, back in December of 2014, you and I had the privilege and the pleasure of covering the first Stipe Miocic versus Junior Dos Santos fight. That was in Phoenix, Arizona. One of the best. Right now, in my opinion, off the top of my head, I say it's the second best heavyweight fight of all time, behind Mark Hunt and Bigfoot Silva, the first one in Australia. But
there might be a couple.
Very, very debatable. And you actually went back and looked at our post-fight wrap-up show from that night in Phoenix, and you had somewhat of an interesting takeaway from that as we prepare for this rematch. What was it?
Yeah, you have to put yourself back in kind of the narrative that we were kind of in at that time. I mean, that was the end of 2014. Junior had just come off of these two brutal fights against Cain. And, leading into this Stipe fight, he was sort of talking and preaching about all of the changes that he'd made to his game and the evolutions and how he had fixed these holes. And then he kind of came out and he fought in a very similar way, not being very defensive against Stipe. And even though Junior won, I mean, I remember that night his face was just completely obliterated, and we were almost talking like it was a funeral service. Like, it was a very odd way to be speaking about a victory, of kind of like almost bemoaning the death of Junior. And obviously at that time we didn't know what Stipe would go on to become. But it's interesting to see kind of how this all comes full circle, because I mean, he's only fought twice since then, but yet we're right back here and he's fighting for the title again.
And not only has he only fought twice since that fight in 2014, he was knocked out in one of those fights. In the follow-up fight, a year later, he was knocked out by Overeem, and then he comes back 13 months ago and beats Ben Rothwell in one of his best performances. We can't deny him of that. But you feel like it's kind of being overlooked that he's only fought twice, he was knocked out once, and he last fought 13 months ago. These are important facts that I feel like haven't been really brought up leading up to this fight.
I mean, maybe it's being overlooked, but it's such a fun fight. Like, I'm not opposed to this. I mean, the heavyweight division is in a strange place right now. There's not an obvious person to throw at Stipe Miocic, and this is a great fight to run back. And like you said, the Rothwell fight really showcased sort of an evolution of Junior. I think, in the damage that he took from both Velasquez fights and that Miocic fight really forced him to look inward in himself and evolve his style and become more defensive. I mean, you saw it in that Big Ben fight. He was moving. He was on his bicycle. He was trying to fight more defensive and not take as many punches. And, if that style continues to here, it could play out, a little differently than the first one.
I remember in the aftermath of the Rothwell fight, we were all blown away by how well he fought. And he had moved to American Top Team, switched things up, but his boxing was so on point, went to the body. I mean, completely outclassed Ben Rothwell. And then you look at Stipe Miocic, who since that loss to JDS has won 4 times, has become heavyweight champion, has knocked out the likes of Andrei Arlovsky and Fabricio Verdum, and of course, Alistair Overeem back in Cleveland. And so I wonder, in your opinion, while the amount of fights aren't equal, who do you think has improved more since they last fought?
And add Mark Hunt to that list, too.
That's true. A very one-sided fight.
Bad one-sided fight. It's interesting because the one thing, it's hard to get a lot from Stipe.
Yeah.
It's hard to kind of
say the least.
Figure out where his mind is unless you're watching like an embedded video or something. He's milking the cow. That was hilarious. But it's the one thing he kind of has repeated a lot over the course of this week is that Junior fight really taught him a lesson that he belonged. And he said that a couple times, that I learned I belonged in that fight. I may not have won that fight, but I knew at that point that I belonged with the best in the world. That was a former heavyweight champion, and he, he took it to him. That was a very close fight, a controversial fight for some people. I scored it for Junior. But ever since then, you're right. Stipe's been on an absolute tear, and he is. If you ask me who's improved more, I would say Stipe.
If Stipe wins this fight, that would be his second successful title defense. That puts him in exclusive company, if you will.
Yeah.
And so is it possible, we were talking about this off air earlier today, is it possible that if he wins this fight in impressive fashion like he has in his last 4 fights, that he should now be discussed in that greatest of all time conversation? Is that even possible, or is it a little too premature despite, what the resume says right now?
Well, it seems bizarre to ask, right? Because he's still young and he hasn't. You hear Stipe and you don't think of him in that rarefied air, but I mean, at least within the UFC, like not counting, a Fedor or some other fighters who fought in Pride and outside of the UFC. Within the UFC, I mean, he certainly enters the conversation just alone by the mere fact of getting that second title defense. Heavyweight division is such a bizarre division in the UFC. The fact that no one has been able to create any level of sustained dominance. I mean, we thought Kane was that guy. We thought Junior was that guy. If you look even farther back, none of them have been able to be that guy. We thought Brock might have been that guy. Nobody has been able to do it. If Stipe is able to at least get to that point, I think he enters the conversation, but I also think it's a little too early to put him, as the greatest UFC heavyweight.
Earlier this year, Stipe was very upset with his contract, said that he thought the UFC took his kindness for weakness, and really seemed to be disgruntled. It has been an interesting road to get to this point. And yet still here, fight week, he's just not the most verbose fellow. I mean, I thought that he was actually quite outgoing with us, but we're working really hard to get something out of him. You almost have to ask him about everything but the fight to try to get him to open up. Is he doing himself a disservice in this day and age where it's clear that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, where it's clear that if you talk, you will get paid a lot, fans will gravitate towards you? Is it a little bit perplexing to you that he still doesn't allow himself to open up? Because we know it's there. We know he's a funny guy. He's personable. He's very entertaining on Twitter. And yet when he comes here to sell the fight, doesn't do much.
You're right. I mean, he's an interesting case because he's exactly that. He's a very funny guy. And if you talk to him off camera, he's a very charming guy. Like, he has that personality. I think almost you just need to give him like a reality show, because like watching him on Embedded just mess around with his coaches and do whatever, like you don't even need to have a plot, just let him do whatever, like that's entertaining to me. And I think that's a kind of a creative way to let him hype himself at that point, like promote himself. But yeah, you're right. Just you ask him about the fight, and it takes forever to get an inch from him.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting case, but I think there's certain ways you can kind of market him around what you would think normal fight promotion would be. It just seems like the UFC often doesn't really look at that route.
Yeah, of course, he's also a firefighter. I mean, he's done a lot, especially in that market. Okay, so let me ask you, who wins, most importantly?
You know what? I think Stipe. I think this goes back to what we were talking about. Both guys have made a lot of improvements, but I think Stipe has improved incredible amount over the past 4 fights. I mean, he really looks, if there was, I mean, we've said this so many times in the past, but if there was ever a UFC heavyweight champion to kind of break past that second title defense, it feels like it's Stipe. So I'm going to pick Stipe.
How does he do it?
I think he knocks JDS out.
Wow. Early?
No, I think it's something late, maybe like a 4th round.
Okay, because typically it's been early for him these days, so we'll see how he does in the championship rounds. Let's move along to the co-main event. It's Joanna Jędrzejczyk looking to get her 5th successful title defense. She meets her former stablemate, if you want to call her that. They were once under the same management umbrella, Jessica Andrade, and they seem to be quite friendly with each other. Not the usual intimidating Joanna Jędrzejczyk face-offs this week, although at the weigh-ins today she did give her the sort of the ceremonial gift that she likes to give her opponents when they square off at the weigh-ins,
which if I might add is one of the best running gimmicks right now in MMA.
It's good to have a gimmick. Some people are saying that Jessica Andrade will be her toughest test, that she is such a heavy hitter, a former 135er. She's looked very good, undefeated since dropping down to 115. Do you subscribe to that theory as well?
I mean, she certainly has the potential to be. I mean, you look at the Karolina Kowalkiewicz fight and also the Claudia Gadelha, both fights even, but really the second fight. Both of those were really hard fights for Joanna. But Jessica, I think the familiarity is something that's really an interesting dynamic to this, because, I mean, Claudia was a little familiar with Joanna, but like Jessica Andrade has sparred with Joanna. They were, like you said, they were friends. They even now, I mean, they're still, chummy with each other, and that's something we haven't really seen from Joanna. It's a very unusual build-up for her. It doesn't feel like the usual Joanna fight. And just even you look at her style. I mean, Jessica was a powerful bantamweight, and she's only gotten. It seems like that power has translated great even at a lower weight. I mean, she has the ability to make it a dogfight, so it could be a long night for Joanna.
Joanna is one of the biggest favorites on the card, and I was talking to some of her coaches this week, and they said that they love this matchup because Joanna is a little bit of a slow starter. She doesn't just kind of throw it all out there in the first round, and it seems like Jessica might be someone who starts strong and then kind of tapers off, so they like that matchup, and they think that she'll be able to best her as the fight goes on. Do you see it going the same way?
You know what, that's a very interesting point. I think over the past few fights we've seen with Joanna, she has gotten really adept and better at being able to play the matador. I think when we were last in Dallas for her fight against Carla Esparza, she fought a very different style, even against Jessica Penne, where she was swarming these girls and just really unloading and pressure-heavy style, get them against the fence and just unload. In her last few fights, she's really been able to play the counter striker and kind of, like you said, start slow but keep building and building and building and let people tire themselves out. And I think that could play well against Jessica.
Does she win? Does Joanna win?
And still, I think Joanna does it. I think she's a little more technical, and I think, like I said, she's going to wear Jessica out and then in the championships rounds really just take it.
But does she get the finish?
I don't think so.
Yeah. I don't think so either. Okay, let's move along. Let's talk about Jorge Masvidal versus Demian Maia. Masvidal has kind of been, I don't want to call him a revelation this week, but I mean, if you look at the views on our videos and whatnot, he's the one who is killing everyone. And pardon the pun, but he's been talking about murder. Came to media day dressed in all black. Said he was there for a premeditated murder. Said he was there for Maia's funeral. Talks a great game. He has done a phenomenal job building up to this fight. And for Maia, I mean, it's hard not to feel for him. He shouldn't really be in this situation. He should probably be fighting for the belt. And we see this so often. Someone's so close, they may be looking past, and then they stumble. Yeah. Maia doesn't strike me as that kind of guy. But are you getting the sense that something weird is going on? And by the way, Masvidal's the betting favorite.
Yeah, that's surprising to me when I saw that, and because he didn't start as the betting favorite. He started as the underdog, and it kind of flipped, which he attributes to his Miami crew really just piling on that money. So who knows? But yeah, you're right. But the thing is, I don't think Demian Maia is the type of person to overlook this, because even throughout this whole week, he's been very reticent to really talk about anything past this. Yeah. He knows that this is more or less, for better or worse, and like you said, it's very unfortunate, because we said this back at UFC 209, he deserves to be fighting for this title. I thought then that they should have done Maia and Woodley and then Jorge versus Wonderboy. When you look at Demian Maia, he's a guy who's 39 years old, so this really is kind of his last run, for better or worse, and that's unfortunate, but I mean, I feel like that's a reality that he knows as well, and he's not, if one misstep against a guy as dangerous as Jorge Masvidal and all of his last chance to get a UFC title shot could crumble. So I feel like he's very, very acutely aware of that.
Masvidal's looked really good since moving up to 170. Are you surprised by this?
No, I'm not at all. I mean, he was always a guy who cut a lot of weight to get to 155, and also just talking to him this week, he said that he was getting frustrated with just the fact that he had to start over, basically. Like, once he fought Gilbert Melendez in Strikeforce, and then as soon as he came to the UFC, he basically had to start from the very bottom of the lightweight division, and it took basically 8 fights before he got like a Benson Henderson or somebody that people knew. And he admitted that almost just took away his motivation, and that once he started getting these ranked fighters and moving up in weight, that fire really reemerged in him. And then, obviously the split decisions, he kind of learned, like, okay, I can't just hang back and play the counter striker that much. I need to push it. And we've seen just this revelation over the past year from him of these brutal knockouts against Ellenberger and then the Cowboy fight, which was incredible.
Seems very confident these days, and not having to cut, an extra 15 pounds would certainly help. If you're Tyron Woodley, who do you want to win?
Stylistically, I almost think Tyron would with Demian. Just because Jorge's a tough fight for anybody, and I think Tyron believes in his wrestling enough that he doesn't think Demian can get him to the ground.
Who gets it done?
Oh, man. I have been going back and forth on this fight the entire week. I honestly don't know. I don't want to split the fence, so I'm just going to say Jorge. I think Jorge maybe does it. But I genuinely have no feel for
what in your gut is making you at least lean in his direction? Because a lot of people, I mean, like I said, he is the betting favorite.
To me, it just seems like one of those situations where in MMA, like, if you miss your moment, maybe it's gone. And maybe Demian, not even because of his fault, missed his moment. And I just have this weird feeling that Jorge is going to play spoiler.
You know, they had a press conference, which we talked about in a different video today, and UFC 213 still does not have a main event. There's an issue with Cody Garbrandt's back. I wouldn't be surprised if either one of these guys has a relatively easy night if they turn him around quickly and have him fight Tyron Woodley, who has been preparing for a fight. So that's another thing to look out for on Saturday. So your official prediction is Masvidal. Do you think he finishes him like he has been doing, or is Maia a little too savvy for that?
God, I don't know. I don't even want to make
I'm asking
a pick.
too much.
I don't even want to make a pick. I'll just say decision because I have no idea.
Okay, and how about this one? The people's main event.
Yes.
El Pantera against the answer. Yair Rodriguez against Frankie Edgar. We did not see this matchup coming. And I want to ask you a question that I brought up on the MMA Hour on Monday. What's the biggest jump, either, up or down? What's the more drastic move? Going from fighting BJ Penn to Frankie Edgar, or going from fighting Yair Rodriguez to Dennis Siver? You get what I'm saying? That fight in January is so bizarre because both guys in their next fight are fighting someone completely different. What do you think? What's the answer to that question? I find it fascinating.
I mean, that's an interesting question. I haven't
Massive jump from BJ Penn in 2017 to Frankie Edgar, right?
Sure, but I would also say that probably it's a massive jump down from Yair Rodriguez.
It's one of the most strange, second fights after. You know what I'm saying? Like the next booking.
It's almost like that fight in January was a silly fight.
Shouldn't have happened. And you were there.
Yeah. I was not happy to be there. It was a very unfortunate thing to watch.
So for Yair, the question is this a little too soon? It's well and good to win against, an Alex Caceres, who he did have a bit of a tough time with, a BJ Penn. But this is Frankie Edgar. This is a guy who could very well be fighting for the belt next. I mean, this doesn't, you don't quite put Frankie in that sort of old timers category just yet, in my opinion. Maybe Saturday night will change that theory. Do you think this is a little too soon for Yair, or do you like the booking by the UFC because it's almost a win-win, as some have suggested?
Well, it's a fascinating question because, I feel like we had this same exact discussion maybe a year or two ago with the Cub-Swanson fight with Frankie. And everybody was saying Frankie's done, Frankie's, Cub's the next guy coming up. And then what did Frankie do? He went out and just established that, no, I'm still here, guys. I'm still relevant. That could very well happen again, but man, every so often in MMA with these really highly touted prospects like a Yair, you get this performance that comes out of nowhere that makes you realize in retrospect, holy crap, we did not realize how good this guy was.
Right.
And this kind of feels like it might be that situation. Yeah. So, but it's so conflicting to me. It's such a fascinating, great fight.
He has really come into his own on the mic. It just feels like he's so much more confident in and out of the cage. He's a phenomenal striker. His wrestling has gotten a lot better. I mean, he really is, in my opinion, a superstar. This is someone that the UFC should really be pushing, and they have. Of course, he is of Mexican descent, so this is a very big deal for them. And so at the end of the day, this could very well determine who fights for the belt next. Yeah. Does Yair get it done? Can he do it? Can he beat Frankie Edgar?
Well, it's interesting because Yair put himself in this spot. Everyone, Sean Shelby was explaining this week that Yair basically handpicked this fight, and not him specifically, but his team asked for this fight. No one asked for Frankie Edgar. That's a pretty bold thing to do. Man, this is the same thing as the Jorge fight. I just don't know which way this is gonna go. If you're gonna force me to make a pick, I'm gonna say that Yair's the bigger guy, he's the longer guy. Frankie may be the faster guy, but Yair's just so creative on the ground, and people sleep on his wrestling, but he has a very good ground game, and he has very solid wrestling. Ultimately, if Frankie's not able to get those takedowns, and I think he won't be able to, I think Yair can just beat him with the length and the speed and just being the younger, more creative guy.
Yeah, the size discrepancy has really been jarring every time they've squared off this week. I think that's been really interesting.
Frankly, I don't understand how Yair makes 145 so easily.
Yeah, and maybe as he gets older, he'll be moving up to 155. Loved what he said this week about this idea that it's a win-win for him. He doesn't want Frankie Edgar's name. He's not trying to build his name off of Frankie's name. He's his own man and doesn't really care what Frankie does. So I think that's a really interesting answer from a young kid.
He compared it to Game of Thrones to me. He said his rise is Game of Thrones, where he's picking and moving these chess pieces.
Love it. Yeah. Okay, before we go, let me quickly ask you about the feature prelim. It's actually airing on FX, not FS1. Yes. It's Eddie Alvarez versus Dustin Poirier, and it's always so interesting to see how someone rebounds from losing their belt. Last time we saw Eddie, lost to Conor McGregor in very dominant fashion. I mean, that was maybe the worst loss of his career. Now he comes back against a Dustin Poirier. Are there more questions about Eddie going into this fight, or a Poirier who's taking a bit of a jump up in competition from a Jim Miller back in February?
I think there are easily more questions about Eddie. I mean, that's one of the biggest kind of letdowns that you can have is the kind of type of performance he had where, all of the talk beforehand, New York, Madison Square Garden, this huge event, Conor McGregor, 2-division champ, and then do what he did and just lay an egg like that. It's difficult because, I mean, Eddie's a guy who's been around for so long, and he too is now an underdog against Dustin Poirier, and it's a bitter reminder of how ruthless this game is. Where, I mean, back in November, which is not very long ago, a few months ago, he's headlining this massive mammoth show champion, and now all of a sudden he's on the prelims.
Yeah.
And an underdog. Things change so quickly in this sport.
Your pick?
Oh man, I'm going Eddie. I think Eddie's still got it. I don't think he's done. I'm going Eddie.
Well, today has been relatively uneventful for the UFC as far as this card is concerned, although when we got here on Wednesday, this card actually had 14 fights on it. Now it's down to 12. We lost the Sergio Pettis versus Henry Cejudo fight, which was supposed to kick off the pay-per-view on Wednesday, Cejudo suffering a hand injury. And then this morning, we lost the Jared Gordon versus Mitchell Quinones fight after Gordon failed to make weight. So we're down to 12 fights, but top to bottom, it's a really fun one. Chaz Skelly versus Jason Knight, the return of David Branch against Chris Jotko. What else is on this card? Courtney Casey versus Jessica Aguilar, her return. I mean, it really is an interesting one. And how about Rashad Colter, who we met yesterday at Fortis MMA? Fantastic story, a single father of 2 who recently lost his full-time job, making his UFC debut in his hometown of Dallas, Texas, on less than 2 weeks' notice. So stick around, a lot more to come right here on MMAfighting.com. We'll have our usual fight night coverage for you. For now, we will say goodbye. We'll see you on Saturday. Enjoy the fights.